So I'm pretty happy to make this pretty informal. So if you've got a question as I'm talking, just stick your hand up or ask the question. I get a little bit tired of the sound of my own voice, so I'd really love you to chime in whenever you feel that you would like to. So just to position where I work, I'm at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, which is here in Melbourne, and we're not part of a university faculty. So that's why I'm kind of not wedded to particular topic areas. As our name suggests, we have a pretty strong remit around the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have 6 domains of change, which you can see there. If you just Google MSDI annual report, you can learn a bit more about what we do. So we're a pretty big institute. We've got probably 150 to 200 staff. We've got an applied behaviour change institute within that called BehaviourWorks Australia, which is where I sit. And then within BehaviourWorks Australia, I run the evidence review service. As I said earlier, this basically is what we do. And and I'm very much driven by the incredible effort that goes into creating knowledge and how that effort is often wasted and not made available to people such as yourselves who make really important decisions about how we live. And there are a lot of people who have done a lot of work out there, and we just need to try to work a little bit harder to firstly help people find that work, but also try and translate it in a way that makes sense to people who are not from the area of research and who need to make important decisions, often in very limited time windows. So if you are a little bit tired, I'll give you the key messages now. I'm going to talk about these 4 points. And the first one, I cannot emphasize enough how much time I spend on making sure that the question is right. And I think in my experience, and I've been doing this in various forms for about 15 years, I think there is always a temptation to just get on and find something and get something done. And paradoxically, the more rushed you are in getting evidence, the more important it is to understand the question that you're trying to answer, because you don't want to waste a lot of time looking for evidence, but you also don't want to, if you're in a hurry to make a very urgent decision, it is always worth thinking about exactly what you're looking for. So we're going to spend a fair bit of time on that. Research reviews as opposed to primary studies are definitely the thing to look for when you're either time pressed or even if you have got the time to delve a little deeper, and I'll explain why. Obviously, just because it's research doesn't make it good. Now, we could spend a whole day talking about quality appraisal of research, but we're going to just really touch on a couple of key questions you can ask yourself if you've got a piece of research in front of you. And of course, even though I'm a researcher and I love research, I know that there's a lot of other things that go across your desk, and context is really important as well. And we're learning more about those other inputs. And what we find when we learn about them is that it really helps us to write a good research review, to know what else you're looking at. Is the research review the thing that you're using, or is it going to be stapled into the back of a 150-page briefing report with data and insights and polling and all that other stuff? Makes a real difference to how we go about our work. This is my favorite saying. It's a long time since Lee Jong-wook said this, but it is really the thing that drives the work that I do and the work that our unit does. The amount of, I think you could all name things that have happened in government. I certainly can in Victoria, where people have just done stupid things and wasted a hell of a lot of money on stuff that just is not going to work. And then, as I said, we've got troves of information just waiting to be used. So yeah, that is a particular favorite saying of mine, and the slides will be made available to you afterwards. The other thing that I've learned is that definitions really matter. And I've come to this a little late in my career, I think, but you know, even a term like research for a person in government versus a person on the street versus a person in a university has many, many different meanings. And if you look at the technical definition, it's basically anything where you're making new knowledge. And a lot of people would call it other things. So data insights, business intelligence, monitoring and evaluation, they're all forms of research because you're taking stuff and you're making new knowledge out of it. Evidence, university research, which is what we're focusing on today, is basically, as its name suggests, research that's been conducted under a certain ethical framework at a university and has been published in a peer-reviewed journal. Now, it doesn't make it good just because it's been published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it has undergone a process of some sort of review, some sort of quality control, and it's also being conducted under some sort of ethical framework. And so we position university research as higher than research that hasn't gone through those checks and balances. Now, evidence is something that I think we're seeing a lot of reference to, obviously, and we know that there's a lot of talk about, I've done my research and where's the evidence. But again, when I talk about evidence today, I'm talking about university research predominantly. But I know that when you have commissions of inquiry, or when you collect data, or even when you do polling of the general public about something, that's a form of evidence. And so again, we need to think carefully about that term. And I actually prefer to use, I'm often talk about myself as an evidence-based policy expert, but probably research-based policy is a better way to position myself. But then I'd have to talk about what research means. So, you know, and then grey literature, I don't know if you've heard the term grey literature a lot, but that's all the stuff that's not in the peer-reviewed journals, which it doesn't make it less useful. It's in fact incredibly useful, particularly if it's coming from a credible organisation that's done a lot of good research of their own. So really, technically, grey literature is documents that are not controlled by academic publishing organisations, white papers, reports, working papers, government reports of international organisations. And it's pretty important to understand that, because we don't have as sophisticated way of obtaining grey literature as we do in peer-reviewed journals, which is underpinned by a business model and attached to university subscriptions. And what that means is that we actually need to partner with people like yourselves so that we can find them, because there is an emerging science about how to find grey literature, but it's not systematically organised under a taxonomy in a database that the university subscribes to. So it's inherently more difficult to find. This is my 5 principles of evidence reviews flight controller. Now, the reason that I've done it this way is because I think about evidence reviews in 3 phases. So one is the takeoff, which is getting the question right. And that's where we really need you. We really need to understand the context and the background. The in-flight phase, which is a lot of what I do, which is finding the data, going to the databases, sifting through the citations. It's highly technical, but it's actually pretty straightforward once you've got the question right, because you can break the question down into its component parts. You know where to find information on particular disciplines, and off you go. And then the landing, which is really important in government, is how do you capture it, but also how do you make it land with the person that needs to understand it? And this is where academics have traditionally done a pretty shit job, actually. So, you know, obviously there's specialized terminology. Research is complicated, and people who are very deep content matter experts, appropriately, they hang out with other people who are really deep content matter experts, and they find it very difficult to lift up and make sense back to someone who needs to make a decision. And my theory, the reason that I've got this sort of flight deck thing, is that I think not nearly enough attention is paid to takeoffs and landings. In my field of research, there's a lot of groovy search engines and technologies, but if you're not getting the question right and you're not landing the answer, then it's kind of a waste of energy. So got a question in the chat about peer-reviewed activity free of at least less prone to bias. It's definitely not free of bias. It's less prone to bias for sure, because basically what's happening is when I write an article, I send it into a journal, it goes out to 2 random scientists somewhere in the world. They have a look over it. They usually make a lot of helpful comments, some unhelpful comments, and then I'm invited to resubmit, or the journal article is rejected. So yes, it's less prone to bias because it's knocked around by other people before it gets to the public. Whereas if I just write an article and put it on a blog, it's not subject to that control. So less prone to, definitely not free of. Okay, so let's dive in. Oh, very good, thanks. Good. I'm glad to be of use with that question. So just to go back to those 4 principles, getting the question right is the first 2. Looking for research reviews, you're already well on the way, judging by the answers to the doodle poll. Understanding quality and understanding the context of the research. So we're going to cover as much as we can of that in the next half hour. Any questions so far? I don't know if anyone wants to test their microphone. Does anyone? I know there's a lot of people who can't use cameras, so if you want to use the chat, I will be monitoring that, but looks like we're either grossly engaged or not interested in asking questions. So, as I said, much to the frustration of a lot of people I work with in government, the first thing I do in the evidence review service is say, get me the person who knows about this, and I want to sit down with them for an hour to an hour and a half. And obviously that can create some frustration, but these are the questions that I often ask. If I'm sitting across the table from you and you've commissioned me to do a review, the first thing I want, who wants to know the answer and what do they want to do with the information? Is this something that your department's just interested in and you want to find a bit of information? Is it informing a decision? What sort of decision is it informing? Is it a major fork in the road, massive investment decision, or is it one of a series of decisions? What's on and off the table? Sometimes people come to me, and I never do this, but sometimes people, we've decided to do this. Can you just find some evidence to support that? Don't do that. I always have to have a neutral starting question. And what that usually tells me is that something's already happened, and my ability to influence it with knowledge is quite limited. And I also want to know, as I said before, what else is going into it. Particularly those first 2 questions, who wants to know the answer and what do they want to do with it, are very useful starting points for any review activity, and arguably for any research activity. So if we move on to, so that's kind of understanding the context, and obviously I'm spending not much time on these, but I think I have supplied Graham with some reading, a book open access book chapter I've written on this, and another article. So, and this plus the slide deck should give you enough to get a little bit further in terms of evidence reviews. So getting the question right is a really interesting topic. Often when people from government come to an evidence review service, they want to know pretty much everything. So can you please find some evidence on, how big is this problem? What are the things that might help? What are the things that can be done in 1 year? What are the things that can be done in 5 years? What do we know about the impact of this on individuals, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously what I try to do is to say, well, let's break that down a little bit. There's a couple of forks in the road here. One way to think about it, I guess, is that if you wanted to think about it in 2 big boxes, you'd think about a what works question and a what's the problem question. So if you're tossing around a lot of questions in your head, you might want to think about it in that way. Do we want to understand more about the problem, which would be things like, what is the impact of removing health services or particular screening services and centralising them? Or what is the experience of having a chronic disease? So that's a what's the problem question. Prevalence questions are like that too. How many people in this community don't pay their tax on time? How many people, if it's a counting question, then that's a kind of a what's the problem question. Let's understand more about the situation. What works is obviously, do tax incentives work? Do regulations work to encourage particular behaviours? Do penalties work to discourage undesirable behaviours? See some smiles there, people from government. They're all different types of question. And the reason it's really important to understand that is they're all different types of research as well. So research to understand the problem versus research to test a drug therapy or a behaviour change intervention. We have to go looking in lots of different areas. Now, in the book chapter, I unpack this in quite some detail. And I'm not trying to sell the book chapter, by the way, because it's open access, so you can just download and read for free. But if you want to have a bit more of a look, good question, Graham. Like that. I didn't think the host was allowed to ask questions, but I will address that shortly. So in the book chapter and in the slide deck, you'll see that we've got the what's the problem and what works. And I've grayed out what works because that's pretty much what every government comes to me to say, we want people to do this, what works to make that happen. And, obviously the type of research that addresses that question, as I said, is different. Because I'm an academic, I've listed all the possible question types and I've gone into quite a bit of detail, but even if you just think about it in terms of what's the problem or what works, there are other very interesting questions for people in universities, like why do we think this works? Probably not something that people who are actually taking action have a lot of time to think about, but what's the behaviour change theory underneath this? You might be looking at risk type information. So what does modelling say would happen if we did scenario A, B, and C? And we saw that obviously a lot in COVID. We had the modelers out with the curves and this is what happens if you don't make this happen. And some of them even had fights with each other about whether their models were better than the other person's models. What are the standards of practice? Often in health, we want to know, well, what do the guidelines say? Because the guidelines have already assembled a lot of literature and expert opinion. And then what's the last one? The last one's critical, actually. I nearly forgot it. Excuse me, I'll just... implementation. We know it works. How do we get it out there? So that's more of a service delivery and implementation question. And often it can be that you might say, well, we know that screening is very important, but we don't know how to get it out to particular parts of the community, or how do we communicate in Victoria? And I'm sure in other parts of the world, there was a massive problem trying to communicate with people who weren't like me and who, English wasn't their first language, or they had particular cultural beliefs. And the governments around Australia acknowledged that they did a pretty bad job in reaching minority communities and people who weren't, English wasn't their first language, culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So that's an implementation question, and there's great answers to that. We've learned a lot from the pandemic, but that's a really important consideration for people in government. I'm just going to pause before we start looking for research reviews. I'll have a look at Graham's question. How does your timeline impact your question definition and your understanding of context? This is a great paradox, Graham, because I think that the less time you have, the more important it is to get the question right, because that's when you're really prone to rushing, right? So if you're just like, oh my God, the minister has to get an answer tomorrow, Jesus, I'm just going to go straight to Google. I'm going to find whatever I can, even if it just has 1 or 2 words. That's when you're taking your greatest risk, in my opinion. So I actually think, as I said, my threshold is 60 to 90 minutes of pretty serious thrashing out of, okay, so you really want to know this. This is what you want to know. Okay, so this is the research we're looking for. Okay. There's an old saying, I don't know if Einstein ever said this, but I'm sure people have heard, if Einstein was given an hour to solve a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes getting the question right, 5 minutes getting the answer. It's pretty much like that, because once you've got the question, once you know what people are looking for, it doesn't take long to find. All right, there's plenty of research out there. I'll show you where you can find it. So, okay, so I'm going to spend a bit of time on how we're going for time. Beautiful. Okay, we're nearly halfway through. Good. I don't know why I've got a cough this morning. I think just haven't had enough coffee. Look for needles, not haystacks. This is the thing that I'm moderately obsessed with in evidence reviews. So I might go to this slide. So just tell me if this might be obvious, you might already know this, but basically there's about 65 million research articles in the world. That's like individual studies. People have gone out, they've tested drug A versus drug B. They've had a look at, what makes people litter. They've had a look at why people don't pay their tax on time. That's 65 million pieces of information. Now, an evidence review basically scoops up a bunch of studies in the same area and says, well, let's have a look at all the studies of why people throw litter on the ground, and we'll see if there's some themes that are emerging. And so when you're looking for research, the single best thing you can do is look for an evidence review, because someone has done some work for you. They've already gone out and scooped up a bunch of studies looking at tax compliance or, motor vehicle registration compliance, or, how do you define medically unfit for driving? They've already done all that for you, and they've put it in an evidence review, and it's all packaged up and the themes. What are some of the failure modes you've seen for this phase of a review? Is that the question definition, Matt? Where are you, Matt? Can't see you. Yes, question definition. Okay. Well, sometimes when you start unpacking the question, sorry, I will loop back to that question because I'm getting the chat in sort of a little bit delayed because I'm not looking at it. So sometimes when you sit down for that 1 hour meeting and people go, oh, I don't know, we kind of want to know a bit about that and a bit about that. And I might say, look, it sounds like you're not quite sure what problem you're solving at this point. Like maybe you need to go think about it a bit more, or maybe you need to talk to some more people and get some more data. So where it can fail is if you actually don't know what you want to review, and someone's just said, look, go get Peter or his team, just get them to do an evidence review on this. So an example of diabetes, right? Diabetes is a really, really serious chronic disease. It has a number of manifestations. And let's say that you're in the Department of Diabetes and someone just says, look, I'm sick of spending money on this. It's the biggest drag on our health system. Just go find research on how to control diabetes, right? If you come to me with that question, okay, so diabetic eye disease, peripheral vascular disease, heart disease, blood pressure control, managing your blood sugars, prevention through diet and exercise. Which part of diabetes do you want to solve? And the client might say, well, they kind of just said solve all of it. And then it would be, well, the thing is that there's so many directions you can go. I can't do a research review on solving diabetes in a week, right? Maybe you want to look at diabetic retinopathy screening and prevent blindness from diabetic eye disease. Maybe you want people to check their sugars more often. You need to think of something, because you're not going to, as a government department, you're not going to commission one review on solving diabetes. 6 weeks later, I come back with the answer, then you implement it. Right. I hope that makes sense. So, things are complex. So you have to be really thinking about the question you want to answer. And I think that's where a lot of effort gets wasted, frankly. That people just go, I don't know, let's find out something about diabetes. Well, let's try something. Try blood sugar. Let's give everyone a free blood sugar monitor. That's where it can go wrong. And actually, you can waste a lot of money very quickly. Okay, so evidence reviews, scoop up stuff, they bring it all together, they put it in a document, they package it up, they've done a lot of work for you. Now, here's the problem. This is the pyramid of paradox. There's about 5 billion pages on the web, right? So if you're just going to a browser and saying solve tax compliance, then you're waiting in the highest level of use, but the lowest level of confidence, because we don't know if it's peer reviewed. We don't know where it's come from. We don't know if there are vested interests. You're basically taking your chances. When I used to work at the physio school, and I used to teach evidence-based practice. I used to say, you know, like if you want to find out information about neck pain and you go to the open web, you're going to get Bob's magnetic pillow neck pain solution mixed with the Cochrane review. And it's just a minefield. Like that's the haystack. So you don't want to play there. 65 million research articles, that's Google Scholar. So you're using a search engine that only looks for research basically. So that's if you do the maths, that's like thousands of times more efficient because you're only playing in research. You're playing in peer-reviewed research. High level of confidence, still quite a ton of stuff to look at. Where you want to play is evidence reviews, right? They are the most reliable knowledge that we have. And there's about 200,000 of them. So if you do the maths, 200,000 divided by 5 billion, your chances of getting somewhere are much, much higher if you look for a review. And they are the single most reliable unit of knowledge translation for policy and practice. Now, what people often say is, oh, my topic's special. There won't be a review on that. There's no one would have, who would have reviewed, you know, this tiny piece of technology that goes into a wind turbine and to see, you know, how efficient it is, or who would have, no one's reviewed that. And I often sit down with them and 5 minutes later, I find something. It might not be great, but I often find something. So I'm going to show you a bunch of slides and you'll get all the web addresses in your slide deck. And I'll show you some places you can go looking. A lot of you are already looking here. Fantastic. Google Scholar's one of a number of open source platforms that look at academic research, and it's a really good place to play. If you do one thing after today, put Google Scholar in your favorites and never go to open Google again. Just use Google Scholar. That will immeasurably improve your access to credible knowledge. I have to advertise the one that we run, which is Social Systems Evidence. It's awesome. It's got about 5,000 reviews on it that we found, and we've pre-appraised them for quality where possible. And we've mapped them to the Sustainable Development Goals and 20 government program and service areas. So if you're looking at gender equality and you're in the Department of Transport, or if you're looking at something to do with health, you can filter, you can stack different filters on, you can sign up for free with an email address. You can set yourself a search alert and get that search every time something new comes in. You can get it to your mailbox. So that's a good place to play. My friends at McMaster in Canada have created a database called COVID-End. And that's got another list of databases of all the COVID-19 knowledge in the world, about 400 clearing sites that have great information about COVID management, public health, what works, in immunisations, transport services. It's all in there. Most of you would have heard about Cochrane because they basically invented the systematic review. So if it's a health topic, I would go no further than the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. Now, what happened about 20 years ago, this is a bit of a nerd fest about, well, thanks for Cassidy for putting the URLs in. That's really helpful. Except that people, yeah, don't get distracted because there's more. I'm going to show you. About 20 years ago, people thought, you know what, if Cochrane can do a bunch of reviews, why can't we do it in our area? Like, just because we're not medicine, right? So Campbell, crime, justice, equality, they've got policy briefs, they've got systematic reviews. Fantastic. And they're pretty good friends with Cochrane, so they're very robust reviews. The collaboration for environmental evidence, hundreds of environment reviews, deforestation, biodiversity, hundreds of reviews. There's another one actually, which I forgot to put in the slide deck on species, on wildlife preservation. Network for Business Sustainability. Great group, do a lot of reviews about business transitions to sustainable practices. So green business. So they're fantastic. Very robust reviews. Evidence for learning, if you're in education, have a look at this homepage. You want to know if behaviour interventions work? Here's the average cost. Here's how confident we are in the evidence, and here's how many months impact we reckon it'll give you in your educational journey. And that they've done all the work. They've worked out all the questions that you might want to answer, and they've reviewed it, and you can get to the primary studies, but they're all already sitting there ready to be used. All of those databases I showed you are open access. Most of them have either a search menu or a search bar. You can just put in, you know, green transport into Network for Business Sustainability, you'll find stuff. Some of it's got like blog content, discussional stuff, but there is serious research in most of those databases that will get you in the same time that you would spend wasting on an open internet platform. You'll get a lot further with one of these databases. And that's just a selection. There are others, as I said. So, reviews. Now I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about quality. And again, this is a little bit of, I guess, under the hood. You could do a 6-week course on this. The Cochrane manual for how you evaluate research is hundreds of pages. So I'm not going to stand up and say this is the definitive course on how to evaluate the quality of research, but I will just give you a couple of questions that you might ask if you've got a piece of research in front of you. So let's imagine that you found a review somewhere, a review article, one of those ones that brings together lots of other articles. And a lot of this is common sense. Like if you think about it, these questions make a lot of sense. So do they know what they're doing? Did they state, this is what we did the review for? Did they tell you what articles they were looking for, what was in and what was out? That's the inclusion exclusion criteria. Did they go and search a lot of databases to find the literature? And then did they describe what they found? Now, the thing about a review is that if you think about it, you're gathering a bunch of primary studies or research that people have done. So you want to look at them and see what their quality is like. So typically in a review, you'll see a statement like, you know, the quality of the research addressing, you know, adherence to taxation regulations was generally medium or poor. And that tells you how much confidence you can place in the review, right? Because there's a saying, if you take a lot of small pieces of rubbish and put them all together, you just get a big pile of rubbish. You don't get the answer. So, you know, if the review says the research is pretty poor, that's important to know because it means you can't really rely on that knowledge in making your policy or practice changes. And you might have to innovate and spend a bit more on monitoring and evaluation to see if it works. And were the conclusions of the review justified? It seems obvious, but sometimes they just say things that are just not supported by what they've done. And, you know, obviously that's the same as any other area. If you need to have a bit of a basis for what you're saying. If you can't find a review and you get a primary study, so let's say we're looking at a primary study of, you know, do fines make people pay their motor vehicle registration on time or their tax on time, then you've got a similar kind of set of questions. So firstly, you know, obviously when you're looking at the study, you want to know, have they actually given you a bit of a background as to this question, why it's important? Was the study design appropriate? Now, that's obviously a massive question. You probably need university research knowledge to know about study design. But look, you know, if you're testing pill A versus pill B, you probably want to have one group that takes one pill, one group that takes the other. Ideally, you have them randomized. And that works for other experiments too. You can randomize jurisdictional level interventions as well by sort of postcode or area. Was a sample representative? So I'm looking at the effect of, you know, an arthritis drug. Now, if I'm looking at people under 40, that's not a very representative sample because most people with arthritis are older. Sorry, I always fall back into health examples. And when I'm talking to non-health people, I try to think of other ones and then I run out of time. Was the detail, how did you measure the outcomes? So again, arthritis, is it just, are you measuring pain? Are you measuring function? Or are you measuring, a 2 degrees more bend in my finger? That's not a useful outcome. And again, were the conclusions justified? So, some of these are just common sense questions, but if you've got an individual piece of research in front of you, if it's a primary study and you look at those questions, and if it's a review, you look at those questions, the name of the game here is if you've got multiple studies. So what I do is I get basically every study I can find on that, and then we do quality appraisal, and it breaks into 2 piles: higher quality research, lower quality research. And when we're going back to our decision makers, we say, well, here's what the high quality reviews found, and here's what the lower quality research found. And obviously you want to be emphasizing the most robust knowledge that you've used. Hope this is all making sense. Interested if there's any questions in the chat, or you could be the first person to ask a question with your microphone if you wanted to. Opportunity is there. Floor is yours. No takers. There's a couple of other kind of, I guess, this is just a bit of a common sense thing. So, and again, you can go really hard on this. Like there are whole systems that rank journals and impact factors and all sorts of things. So, there are some really rubbish academic journals. A lot of them spam people like me every day and say, would you like to, dear esteemed Professor Peter Bragge, would you like to submit an article to this journal that I've never heard of? So I know where the good journals are. So you might have examples in your area where of an organisation like obviously a National Road Safety Authority is a more credible organisation than a smaller body that you haven't heard of, that perhaps based in one particular region. So there's the credibility of the publisher. Then there's the credibility of the institutions. I used to say to the physio students, if you're looking for stuff on neck pain, maybe have a look if it comes from a university as opposed to a commercial enterprise. Just a couple of little signals that might help you elevate or assess the credibility. And obviously, the credibility of the authors is very important. And just like there are journal rankings, there's rankings of, I've got some sort of number in Google Scholar about how many people read my articles. If you're in a particular area, you probably know some of the researchers that are pretty prominent. So Graham Curry's the transport guy at Monash. He does the transport research. If I'm looking for some information about transportation, I'll have a look at something that Graham's written because he's, probably one of the world leading academics. But the flip side of that is the conflicts of interest. So there's obviously been some pretty celebrated cases of authors that just haven't disclosed something, commercial interest. There's a lot of commercial sponsorship in universities because they don't get much funding. And, that can influence or appear to influence the results of research. So that's a couple of other little considerations. So those 3 slides are kind of my version of what would normally be a 6-week course in research appraisal. So just bear that in mind. I take no responsibility for the outcomes of that 10-minute course. And finally, the bit that you know about, but I don't know as much about, which is research is not the only input. So again, when you're at that getting the question and context and who's making the decision and what's on the table, I want to understand, as someone who's outside of the tent, I want to know what's going on in terms of what's going in front of the minister or what's going in front of the person making the decision. And I'm absolutely fine if it's just if it's not a very weighty decision that's going to impact the whole world. That doesn't mean it's not important. It might be very important for getting a background understanding in the department, getting your handle on an emerging area. Incredibly important. there's a great report that literally just came out in January this year from my friends at McMaster in Canada, called the Evidence Commission Report. And I'd strongly urge you, it's a very, very long report, but maybe have a look at the executive summary, because this diagram here is probably the best representation of what's going on in your area that I've seen as an academic, as someone outside the tent. And it basically says, and if you think about this in terms of COVID, right? We had the modelers, we had the forecasters, we had the people writing the guidelines, we had the cost effectiveness analysis. In my world, we had a lot of why would people do this? What's the underlying behavior? Why do people believe in conspiracy theories? And I know, I know that I'm only a little part of that. So evidence synthesis is a little part of what comes across your desk. And knowing that changes what I do, particularly knowing the details about the other inputs materially changes what I do. The other thing I want to touch on in the time we've got left is qualitative insights. So this is a bit of a revelation, but sitting down and talking to experts in the field or people who have actually done this before is incredibly helpful. And we're one of the first research review units to combine interviewed data with what we find in published research. And I'll show you a couple of examples if we've got time. But basically, there's a couple of disadvantages to the world of research. I've talked it up, but there are a few disadvantages. Firstly, it takes ages to get stuff published. So if you're on the cutting edge of an innovation or a very new trend or a new movement, you're not going to find much research. Publication lag's a big thing. Peer review is not perfect. Peer reviewers aren't paid. They just kind of have to do it in their spare time. So it takes a long time. Secondly, just because something worked in Victoria, Australia, it doesn't mean it's going to work in New Jersey. So what's happening on the ground? How acceptable is it to a particular population? As I said, we made a lot of mistakes with culturally and linguistically diverse populations in COVID. We just assumed that what worked for a middle-aged white guy like me is just going to work for everywhere else. And it failed. It failed really badly. And a lot of people suffered as a result. So you want to know what's happening on the ground, warts and all. Is this acceptable? Is it feasible? And the gold, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is when you get insights from the ground that overlap with what you've found around the world of literature in that area. So this is an infographic that we use for all of our evidence reviews if we do a practice review as well. And what we send back to the client, which is often the only thing they look at after all the work we've done, is this page right here, which is basically first circle. Here's everything we found when we looked at all published knowledge around the world. We found very weird interventions, some pockets of innovation in different parts of the world. So that's the left-hand crescent. The right-hand crescent is, here's what happened when we talked to 6 to 8 experts in the field. We talked to the roads authority guys, we talked to the people that do the roadworthy certificates, we talked to some older drivers, and we got some insights from talking to them. And in the middle is the themes identified in both activities. And that is the hot zone for local knowledge and implementation, because that's telling you what is evidence-based and might work on the ground. Now, at a principle level, what that means is that if you're sitting in an office and looking at some research and you don't have the resources to do a full-on practice review, find a university near you, find an expert, get on the phone and just say, hey, I'm reading about this and I'm just wanting to know, or find someone on the ground, find a service deliverer and just say, do you reckon that it would work if we did this? Or, just talk to some people in that area and see if you can find something that's written down in a nice piece of research that also might land in your area. And that will get you a lot further. Here's a couple of examples just to finish of what that looks like when you publish it. So basically, this is an article that we did on reducing diagnostic error in emergency departments. And here's all the stuff we found when we looked in the literature. And here's what we found when we talked to people. And we also did a little citizen panel. And so where you get the 3 ticks, you're in that zone of overlap where you say, well, it looks like training is really important, and the people, that most people agree that you need that. The other thing is that the citizens come up with ideas that no one else has thought of. They're kind of like, well, I already gave my history when I went to another emergency department. Why can't they find that record, right? Or, the guys have been up for 12 hours. Like, do these guys have a rest? And, they come up with ideas that maybe haven't been surfaced. So it gives you your pockets of innovation and also gives you overlap. Here's another example. Some work we did around real-time prescription monitoring. And we know that opioid overdoses are a massive issue all around the world. So this was, what's going to help the local doctor use prescription monitoring. And here's what we found in literature. Here's what we found in a focus group. And here's what we found when we talked to doctors. So, for an implementer, this gets you a lot further than just the theory, because it's actually telling you, well, I need to know why this program is important in my practice, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of my Cook's tour through the world of takeoffs, flying the plane and landing. We're almost out of time, but we've got 3 minutes for questions. And I'm also happy to, I'm a little bit behind on email, I've got to tell you. So you'll have to be patient. Follow me on Twitter if you like. Most of the stuff I put on Twitter is complete. It's actually political commentary. So it's not as important as probably my email address. But I'd be happy to take some brief questions now. If you've got some reflections that you want to share in the chat, please do. And otherwise, I'll just hand it over to you guys for some, got 2 minutes. This is your chance.